Right, okay guys, so today we're going to look at deploying generic Docker containers. And by generic Docker containers, I mean Docker containers that are not part of or included in the Community Applications plugin that many of you UNRAID users use. So the Community Applications plugin is actually a fantastic plugin of literally hundreds of pre-configured Docker container templates, which makes literally deploying Docker containers on your UNRAID system super easy with just a few clicks. But there will definitely be probably some times where you'll actually want to deploy your own containers, maybe as part of a private registry, or maybe just some containers from other registries that aren't on DockerHub, and you don't have the option to install the application from the Community Applications plugin. I actually deploy several sort of test and development containers here at home onto my UNRAID system just to test them out. And the other reason why there may be various different Docker containers that you won't ever find in the Community Applications plugin is simply because the container itself contains proprietary software. If you read through the Community Applications plugin page, I did notice a few months ago that it did say in there that if the source was not open source, or they couldn't actually vet the code that's running in there, then they probably wouldn't approve any developer submissions. So anyway, that's just a few reasons why you may want to continue watching this video if these things sound representative of your current situation. So anyway, without further ado, let's just jump straight in and take a look at the first example. Right, okay, so first of all, we want to log into our UNRAID server. Just do that now. And then once in here, we should then verify that Docker is actually enabled. So we're going to click on Settings, and then we should see this Docker icon here. So click on that. Assuming it is enabled, obviously this drop down here will be yes. So if we now just drop this down to yes, once you've changed the enable Docker option to yes, we can now click apply. Okay, and so now Docker is running. We can now click on the Docker tab. Now, if you already use the UNRAID Community Apps plugin, you may already have some Docker containers in here. If not, and it's empty, then that's fine. We're going to start filling it up shortly. So we're actually going to install the official Nginx Docker container. So what we want to do is click on tags, and we're going to basically use this latest version. So we're going to take the contents of this field. We actually just want this part. We're not interested in the Docker pull section. So I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to head back over to UNRAID. So inside the add container screen, we first of all want to give it a name. So we're going to use Nginx, and we'll just call this Nginx public. And the reason why I'm calling it public is because I'm going to do two examples here. I'm going to pull Nginx from DockerHub, and I'm also going to pull Nginx from a private repository. So I'm going to demonstrate how we can actually basically authenticate to a private registry. And for the repository, I'm just going to paste Nginx latest in. And so now for this particular container, we just want to expose a port so that we can basically connect to the container and view the demo web page that they provide. So anyway, we're going to go and click on this add path port variable label or device. And we're going to change the config type here down to port. Now we're going to give it a name. So for your information, the name here really doesn't matter. It's just going to, over here on the left-hand side, it's going to basically use that name for your future reference if you were to edit this container, for example. But anyway, we're going to call this HTTP port because that's essentially what we're now going to add. So the container port is actually the port inside the container that the service, in this case Nginx, is actually listening on. So I know from the documentation on the Nginx Docker page that the container port is port 80, and I'm assuming that if you're obviously watching this video, you already understand what container ports you need to map to as part of some kind of web page that you're looking at, which is detailing what you need to do to spin up a Docker container. So anyway, the host port, this particular field here is the port that the NAS will listen on. So in this case, our UNRAID server will listen on, and then basically it will transfer the traffic that's coming in on that port, pass that through to the container, and map it to port 80 inside the container. So what we're going to do is the host port here, we're going to change to 8081. And that's because I'm going to spin up a few containers. So you can have this whatever you like. Really doesn't matter. I mean, any traffic that comes into UNRAID will basically transfer from this port into this port, for want of a better way of saying it really. I'm just going to try and keep this as untechnical as possible. So anyway, at this point, I'd recommend just copying this value and actually pasting it into the default value field. It just means that later on, if we were to delete this container and at a later date come back and want to reinstall it, we can then use this selector template and drop that down, and then it will pre-fill the fields when we next try to re-add it. So TCP is the correct connection type. We can leave that as is, and it's up to you if you want to add a description. Again, it's really just for like user experience. It just displays that description inside the UNRAID Docker container list. So I'm just going to leave that. We don't need to add that. So now I'm going to click add. And as you can see, it's now added the name that we gave. It's a HTTP port, and it's using this 8081, and it's telling us that it's going to map it to the container port of port 80. So this really is the most basic example of adding a Docker container. At this point, we can now click apply, and after a few seconds, it'll actually pull that container down from DockerHub and start it up. Okay, and when we get to this point, it's already actually started the container. It's passed through, as you'll see here, that port. So it's anything on the left-hand side is essentially the host port. So if we were to connect to this IP address, so this is our UNRAID server's IP address. If we were to then use port 8081, it would then transfer that traffic essentially to the container port on port 80. So at this point, we can now click done, and it will take us back to the container listing. And as you can see, UNRAID has already started the container. And if you've seen in the past or you've used the community applications, when you actually like deploy an app, it'll have a nice icon. So we can actually go and edit this now, and we can actually add our own custom icon. So let's just do that. You'll also notice at this point that we've got a lot fewer options than what we'd normally have if you had deployed a container as from a community applications app. But let's just edit this now, and what we can do is we can change the view over here. So switch this switch from basic view to advanced, and scroll down, and we're going to basically add an icon. So we need to essentially have a PNG image, and it needs to be a URL. So we need to basically host an image file somewhere. I'd recommend you keep the resolution so square. So for example, 300 pixels by 300, and the other one I think is 225 pixels by 225. As long as they're square, the icon should look decent. And also, just to mention, you can also use transparent backgrounds. I'm going to demonstrate that now with two different icons. But if I open this up, you can see that this Nginx icon actually uses a dark grey background. And if I then use the Studio Server example, that's actually a transparent background. It's only showing grey because that's just the interface of Mac OS X that's making that grey, but I can tell you that that definitely is a transparent background. Anyway, okay, and so to add the icon, we actually need the image. So in this instance, we're going to use this Nginx image, but it needs to be hosted somewhere on the internet or hosted locally, but it needs to be accessible as a URL. So I've just gone and uploaded that URL to a website. So I'm just going to go and paste the URL into this field here. And now there's a few other options that we can actually do, which I'll just quickly talk about. The DockerHub URL, if you were to add the URL there, it doesn't have to be the DockerHub URL. It could be a URL to an info page specifically about that container. It's just the URL that it will go to when you normally click on the apps icon, and from the drop-down menu, when you click on the more info link, that will then take you to that particular URL. We don't need to do that for this specifically. However, if you continue to watch the video where we actually do a more complex Docker container deployment, I will show you how that works there. In addition to that, the web UI is also pretty useful. Again, later on in this video, I'll demonstrate that. But for now, I just want to add the icon. So I'm just going to paste in that URL and then hit apply. So at this point, UNRAID is going to basically reconfigure the container, and as part of that process, it actually stops it and then restarts it. So just be aware of that. Next up, just click done. And when we're taken back, we'll see that we've got the icon now. And the reason why it's a square with the grey is because, as I mentioned, the icon itself didn't have a transparent background. So anyway, now that we've deployed that Nginx container, we can now go and open it. So going to navigate to the port which we exposed, which is 8081, press enter there. And there you go, we can now see the welcome to Nginx page. And you'll notice, if it wasn't obvious, that if you were to stop this container, Once stopped, if we try to refresh this page, we're no longer going to be able to connect to it. Okay guys, so that is probably the most basic example as to how we can pull down a generic Docker container from DockerHub or another public repository. In this next section we'll now look at how we can authenticate to and pull down and configure a Docker container using an image from a private registry. So let's just jump straight back in and get to it. So there's a few reasons why you might want to do this. Say for example, if you're testing or for educational purposes, you're building your own containers and you don't want them publicly accessible on the internet, then you can obviously push those containers to a private registry. Because UNRAID doesn't have like a graphical way in which you can authenticate to a private registry, in addition to no actual options within inside this interface to connect to a private registry, we actually need to go and basically do a little workaround. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to demonstrate to you the private registry that we're going to connect to, and then how we're going to authenticate to it, and then basically we're going to go and pull another Nginx container, but this time it's going to be we're going to call it Nginx private, and I'm going to demonstrate adding it without being authenticated, in addition to pulling it once we are authenticated, and just to demonstrate what you would see in the instance that you need to authenticate to it. Okay, so I'm going to jump across to here, and I'm just going to quickly browse through my my private Docker registry. So we're actually going to deploy this particular container image. So this is an Nginx test, and if you're wondering how I've done this, what I've done is I've pulled the official Nginx container from DockerHub this morning. I've retagged it, and then I've basically pushed it to my private registry, which is accessible on this URL. Again, like I demonstrated on the DockerHub pages, we want to omit this first part, and we just want to take the actual registry FQDN, the registry name, and the container image name, and then the tag. So at this point in our private registry, we're just going to copy this, and we're just going to head back over to UNRAID. Again, at this point, we're now going to click on Add Container, and this time we're going to call it Nginx Private. And for the repository, I'm going to paste that URL in. So again, just to clarify, for private registries, you're going to need to specify the FQDN, or like I mentioned, the domain name essentially of the private registry. Like when we added the public one, we're just going to go and add a port, and this time, just to separate them, we're going to use a different port number. So HTTP port again, the container port, again, the actual container port. So the Nginx is listening inside the container on port 80, so we type in 80 here. And the host port this time, instead of 8081, we'll use 8082. And again, we're just going to copy and paste that into the default value, and I'm going to click Add. And finally apply. Now this time we're expecting it to actually fail, and as you can see, because we're pulling it from a private registry, we're now getting this error here. So error response from daemon saying no basic auth credentials. So we somehow need to authenticate UNRAID with our private registry. So let me show you how we do that. So let's just click Done here. As I mentioned earlier on, we copied the values that we're adding to those containers into the default values. And that's really important for this next part. I'll show you how we can now save a whole load of time by not having to manually recreate that container just because it simply failed to create this time because of the failed authentication on that private registry. So anyway, to authenticate our UNRAID system to our private registry, we're going to go up to here and we're going to click on this terminal icon here, which will bring it open our web terminal. So at this point, we can now use standard Docker commands. However, whilst you could go and deploy a Docker container directly from the console inside UNRAID, I would highly suggest you do not do this, because if you were to go and deploy it via the terminal, the container itself will not show up on the web UI, and then it will just make your life a lot harder when trying to manage containers from the terminal. And to be honest, it's just best practice to do it through the web UNRAID UI. This really is just a workaround, and to be honest, it's probably as far as I would really want to go with sort of doing stuff behind the scenes with Docker when running it on UNRAID. But anyway, to log into our private registry, we're going to want to type in here Docker login, and then we want to use the FQDN of our registry. So in my case, it's going to be registry.hallinet.com, and we just press enter here. Now it's going to ask us for the username, so we're going to enter my username, and we're going to specify the password. and that's because I got it slightly wrong. So I'm just going to re-authenticate. And there you go. So in theory, you should get this message here. And if so, you can see login has succeeded, which means that UNRAID is now authenticated and has stored the access token for our private registry, which means that when we deploy containers through the UNRAID UI, it will now succeed. It will be able to connect to and pull down those containers. Now, whilst in theory this will cache those credentials on UNRAID for a certain period of time, I'm not exactly sure how long that is. You shouldn't need to do this very often at all. However, if you do, for example, one day realize that you can't update a container, then just come back into here and you can re-authenticate to the private registry simply using this method as demonstrated here. But anyway, for now, we can now close this. And if we now go back to go and add that container again, we'll click Add Container. And instead of having to refill this out again, we can just drop this menu down and we can basically choose our Nginx private template. And as you can see, this is user templates. So I'm going to click on this. And because we pre-filled those values with the default value, as you can see, it's automatically pre-populated it. So we don't need to go and just manually add it this time. But anyway, that's all looking good. That's got all the details in that we had last time. So now we can click apply, and then it should now go away and download that container image from the private repository. And there you go. So as you can see, it's now pulled it and click done. And again, we can, if you want, we can just quickly go and add the icon again. So we can go into here, edit. So remember advanced view and icon URL, paste that in there and hit apply. And done. Okay, so we've now got two Nginx containers, one using a public image from DockerHub and one using a private image from my own private Docker registry. And the difference between these two is because we use different host ports. This is the public container, which is accessible on 8081, and then our private Nginx container image, and therefore the container that's using that image, is accessible on 8082. So if I now just open up this tab, I've already pre-filled this 8082, press enter, and again, we're seeing exactly the same as what we saw on the other image. And there you go. So we're now connected to that container, which uses the image from the private registry. Okay, so that's pretty cool. And if you want to stick around for this next section, we're going to look at a more advanced example where we'll be mounting various different volumes to our UNRAID system into the container, as well as exposing multiple ports and setting some environmental variables. I'll also be going over some of the more advanced features within UNRAID, such as auto starting containers, changing the boot order of those containers, and generally just some other hints, tips and tricks. So if you want to stick around for that, let's just jump back in. Okay, and so now let's go and look at a more complex container where we're going to actually map volumes. So let's just go and take a look at this website. This is actually giving us basically an example command to run. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this command and we're going to translate it into what UNRAID basically needs us to enter in order to make this work. This is publicly hosted on the DockerHub. Again, as I mentioned in the video earlier, there is no fully qualified domain name on the start of this. So this is just a standard public Docker container image. So what we're going to do is let's just quickly read through this command. So this is basically going to run a container. It's going to call it Studio Server. So jumping back to UNRAID, when we add a container, this name field here essentially translates to, so let's now go and add that first of all. Call it Studio-Server. You can actually name it whatever you like. I mean, I'm just going to, just for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to translate between the two so it's really simple to understand. So I'm taking this name here and I'm simply going to put it into this name field. Next up, we want to add the repository. So the repository, like I mentioned in the previous two examples, is going to be the repository. So in this case, just AliBB, because that is because it's DockerHub, as I mentioned, we don't have the fully qualified domain name portion at the start. And then the actual container image name is going to be Studio Server. And then the last section, which is the : latest, that's just basically the container tag. So I'm going to copy that now. I'm going to paste that into repository here. So we've got a few other things. We've got this restart unless stopped. So basically this means that the container will automatically start up when the host machine boots. So in this case, when UNRAID starts up, if it was using this unless stopped option, then assuming you haven't shut down or stopped that container prior to the shutdown of UNRAID, then when you turn it back on again, this container will automatically start up. Now, unfortunately, in this particular screen here, we don't actually have the ability to change the startup type. That's okay, because once we've created the container, I'll show you on the list of Docker containers how we can actually specify a container to automatically start and stop with UNRAID. So let's just jump back. So we've now covered that piece. So the network type is bridge, which essentially means that any clients on your network, on your LAN, or inside your your local area network that hasn't been firewalled, for example, can actually connect to the container. So jumping back to UNRAID, that is basically this saying here. So network type is bridge, and we want to leave it like that. Generally, when you're adding containers into UNRAID, you're going to want to leave that type as bridge. So like I mentioned earlier, there may be some web pages that you visit with custom containers that may specify a different type of network type. You have of course got host, none. So if you don't want to allow the container any sort of access, like network access into it, then you can use none. And you've got the custom bridge interface. But yeah, so we want to use this standard bridge interface here, or this setting, should I say. And to be honest with you, we're going to leave a console shell command. We want to leave that as shell, and privileged we want to leave off, because the actual documentation for the container doesn't specify that we need to give it any sort of elevated access. Jumping back over, so we've now got this -e, and it's telling us to set it to TZ equals Europe London. So let's just break this part down. -e is basically specifying that it's an environment variable, and the variable key is going to be TZ, and then the value is going to be anything after basically after the right hand side of this equal sign. So in this case, it's Europe London. So I'm just going to copy that, and I'm going to head back to UNRAID, and we're going to now click on this, add another path, port, variable, label, or device. When clicking on that, it's going to bring up this modal, and we want to change the config type to variable. So UNRAID just calls it variable, but essentially it is an environmental variable. And we're now going to add the name of the variable. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this name value here just basically just adds whatever you type into that field just down here, just for your own reference later on if you want to come back and edit the container. So we're going to call this time zone, because that's what it actually means. And then the key, as per the website, it was TZ, and then the value is Europe London. As I mentioned before, copy and paste that into the default value. It will save you trouble later on, where if you wanted to redeploy it, you wouldn't have to go and like repopulate this field. And we can just click add here. So heading back, we've now done that, and we've got 3 instances of -p. So this particular argument is basically saying we want to expose a port. So P stands for port. Then on the left side of this colon here, this is basically the host port. So any traffic that goes to the UNRAID server's IP address bound for port 5432 will then get mapped and transferred to the containers port on 5432. So a lot of Docker containers will generally probably use the same values either side. However, some web containers, for example, because port 80 is so common, it might have port 80 on the right hand side, so therefore the container port, and then port 8080 or 8082 or something like that on the left hand side, which would be the port that you're accessing through the UNRAID server. So it's important to note here that you can't have more than one container using the same host port. So let's now add each of these ports into UNRAID. So I'm going to copy this, and because they're both the same, we can just easily sort that out, and we'll just click on this link again. Again, we're going to change the config type, this time to port. I'm going to give it a name. So that particular port we know is the project server, and we're just going to paste that in, and the host port. Remember, because they match, we can just keep those the same. And again, we're going to set the default value to 5432 and then click add. I'm now just going to repeat that process for the other 2 ports. Okay, so with each of those 3 ports that have now been configured, we can now move on to the volume section. So -v here is saying that we want to mount a persistent volume from the host machine. So again, anything on the left-hand side is host, anything on the right-hand side is container. So basically, we want to set a path on our host, and we want to map it into the container at this path here. So this time we're going to copy this value, and we're going to go back to UNRAID, and we're going to go and click on add another path, port, variable, or label. And this time we're going to keep it as path, and we're going to basically call this hooks. And the container path is, we're going to paste that in. And now we want to specify where it's going to live on our UNRAID server. So it's common that when community applications are installed, they actually create a folder structure under app data to store persistent information. So I'm going to click on app data, and I'm now going to create a folder called studio-server, and I'm going to add another / there. I'm going to call this hooks. So in theory, UNRAID's going to create this studio server folder underneath our app data directory, and then it's going to create this hooks directory to basically store our hook configurations and scripts that this particular Docker container uses. So again, like we did before, I'm going to copy that, I'm going to paste that into here. Access mode, the majority of the time, and as UNRAID has clearly selected it as default, this is going to be the most common sort of access mode. So I would personally leave it as read-write. However, you do have other options, but you can go and explore those later on. And if a Docker container, for example, explicitly says it only needs read-write access for a particular volume mount, then you can obviously change it to read-only. There's more information on the UNRAID website about the different access modes, but for now and for each of these volumes, I do specifically need to set it to read-write because the container does need to both read and write data to each of these volumes. So I'm going to click add there. And as you can see, it's now added hooks, and we've got that path set correctly. Come back to the website again, we're now going to add the database directory. Now, let's pay attention to this, because if we scroll down, we've actually got some information that says, so for example, this volume contains the relational database service, Postgres, for storing and serving metadata to client devices. It is recommended that this volume is mounted on fast storage. So this is really good because anything inside the app data directory that we've already been mounting information to is actually already stored on the cache drive, and UNRAID, and generally that is an SSD or an NVMe drive in an UNRAID server. However, in the next example, the backups directory, it does say, used to store the project library backups. It is recommended that this volume is mounted to parity protected storage, such as a local RAID array or remote NFS mount point, as it doesn't benefit from high-speed storage. Now, if your cache drive inside UNRAID already is parity protected, so for example, you're actually mirroring the drive using ButterFS, then obviously you can ignore that and you can equally push all your backups to that same app data directory that lives on the cache. However, in this example, I will actually switch that and we'll go and create a separate share inside UNRAID to specifically store that backup information. But anyway, let's just jump back to here and we'll just go and add the other paths now. Studio server / database and then / again. And the default value, like I mentioned, we'll copy that, paste that into here. Again, read-write is the access mode we need. I'm just gonna click add. Let's now go and add the other 2 paths. So we're now at this point going to map the backups volume. And like I mentioned, we specifically want to make sure that this is saved to an UNRAID share. Now I've already set up the UNRAID share, but what we can do is we can click on add, path again, and this time we're going to call it backups. And for the container path, we're going to paste in that / backups. And then for the host path, we want to scroll down to where we've actually created that studio server backups share. So this means that any backups taken by this container is going to go to our parity protected array, and in the event that our cache drive dies, which is probably more likely than our storage array, if you haven't mirrored your cache drive, then we can be sure that our data remains intact. So again, it's going to paste this path into the default value and accept the read write and click add. And then finally, we just got this jobs path to add. So I'm going to copy again this etc cron d, head back to UNRAID, click add another port. I'm going to keep the config type as path. I'm going to call this jobs container path. I'm going to paste that. And then this time we're going to use app data again. I'm going to type in studio-server, and we're going to call it /jobs. Copy and paste that into there. Again, read write, click add. So anyway, at this point, that all looks good to me. So what we can do is we can now click apply. So it's now going to go away and obviously download that container from DockerHub. We'll just give it a few seconds and then we should be ready to test it out. Okay, at this point you can see that the container has been pulled down. This particular container is 229 megabytes. And as you can see, this somewhat represents what we're seeing on this particular web page. The difference being is that UNRAID actually adds some additional labels and various other things. So for example, this -L here specifies a label with the key value of net.unraid.docker.managed equals dockerman. But you can ignore that. That's absolutely fine and as expected. Also, in this example, UNRAID's actually been more explicit and is actually specifying the read-write type on each of these volumes, which again is also fine and can be ignored. One thing that you might note and might cause some confusion. Now, this environmental variable here, this TZ, which, as I mentioned from this documentation, is the time zone. Now, UNRAID is actually passing this variable through by default. Some documentation might not include this. However, because this particular container does make heavy use of the time zone variable, Docker by default, if you were to run it as a command line like this, wouldn't normally pass this through. But you see, UNRAID has actually injected this variable here, and it's actually using the UNRAID server's configured time zone. And you see, if we scroll down a little bit, we move down here, that it's actually essentially duplicated it, but it's basically added some quotes around this. This is absolutely fine, but I just thought I'd mention as to why it's appearing twice. It absolutely doesn't make any difference at all. You can leave it in. Ideally, I would just recommend adding variables that are mentioned inside the documentation to make sure that it correctly works. But anyway, at this point, we can now click done. And heading back to our UNRAID list of Docker containers, we can now see that the server is started, but again, we haven't got that nice icon. So let's just go and make a few edits to this particular Docker app, or Docker container, should I say. I'm going to click edit here. And as you can see, obviously these are our settings that we added earlier, but we're going to this time change the view again. So from basic view, I'm going to click on it to switch to advanced. So from here, we're actually going to add a few different things. So this field here, DockerHub URL. Now, this doesn't actually have to be the DockerHub URL. This really is just the link that you get taken to when you click on the Docker containers icon and it drops that menu down. When this field is populated, you will then get the ability to click on a link called more info. So for the purposes of the video, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to basically just copy that URL and I'm going to paste it into DockerHub URL. Next, the icon URL. I've also uploaded that other icon, which I mentioned I've actually added specifically with a transparent background. So I'm going to paste that into there. And then next, the web UI. Now, because I mentioned earlier that this particular container has a web interface, so where we can actually log into and manage the container, like I'm sure many Docker containers do have, we can actually now specify that here. And again, that then adds another item to the drop-down menu. So we're going to type in http:// and what we want to do is we're actually going to use a special variable basically. So we're going to use square brackets and we're going to type in IP here. So we're surrounding capitalized IP with square brackets. What that will do is UNRAID will actually basically replace that placeholder, that bracket, IP bracket, with the actual IP address of the UNRAID server. So it'll basically replace it with this. Next, we want to add a colon, and we now want to add the specifically add the container port that we added for our web interface. So based on the documentation as shown here, we can see that 8543 is the web administration panel. So head back to here. So we've got the colon 8543. And now if we were to go and click on apply, we should now see the new icon, some new items in the menu, and also the ability to click on the web UI menu item and be taken directly to that web interface for the container. So again, we can now click done. And now you see we've got this amazingly cool icon, and as you can see around the outside, it is blended in nicely with the background because it is transparent. So just a quick tip, I do believe that in UNRAID, the icon files has to be a .png. And to be fair, if you want the transparency anyway behind the icon, you will need to use a PNG anyway because JPEG doesn't support transparent backgrounds. So I just thought I'd mention that. Additionally, if we drop these down, you can now see all the different ports that you're mapping to the container and the different mount points. Next up, if we click on this icon now, you'll see that we've actually got some additional menu items. So we've got Web UI, which when we click it, will actually take us to the container. So this is actually the admin panel for that container. So that works as expected. And as you can see, the container spun up and working great. So if I now close that, in addition to that, if we click the button again, we've actually got the more info link that has now appeared, because if we click on that, that's now going to take us to that URL of the Studio Server webpage that we added when we edited the configuration. And apart from that, I do believe that is pretty much everything else. Now, when you're running a container, if you click on the console link in the menu, you'll be able to basically access the sudo console, and you can then run commands. So for example, in this particular container, I know there is a binary called studio, and I can go and check the version of that. And equally run any other console commands. Anyway, exit that. And then also just quickly with regards to the restart type or the restart policy, this command example shows that we want to set it to unless stopped, or ideally set it to unless stopped. Now UNRAID is slightly different in the fact that you can either have a container auto start or not auto start. So when you reboot UNRAID, if you change this value here to on, so this container will automatically start up in order from top to bottom. And if you want to change the actual startup delay for each container, so it'll start the first one and then delay for a certain amount of time, that can all be done with inside the settings Docker window. And equally, if you want to change the startup order of Docker containers, because let's say you've got a database container and then you've got a web container underneath, but the web container relies on the database container, then you can use these drag handles here to basically change the order of how they appear in the list, but also the startup order. So like I mentioned, it will start the containers, if they're set to automatically start, from top to bottom. Next up, in addition to that, it's also good to know that if you are deploying your own private containers, so such as using the private registry, UNRAID will go away and periodically check for any updates. And as you've probably already seen, if you're using the community applications, you'll then get this little link that will appear from up to date. You'll get this little link that will appear here in place of the up to date message. It will say update ready. So normally you can click on that, but if you are deploying your own private registry containers and you want to force an update, you've got two options. You could actually click this check for updates. UNRAID will go away and check, and if there is any updates, it will automatically change any of these values to upgrade. Otherwise, what you can do is you can actually click on this basic view button here. That'll expand this, and you actually have the ability to click on this and force an update. So if we were to click on this now, despite it saying there isn't an update, it'll actually go away and attempt to pull the latest version. But as you can see, this is saying the image is up to date. And just be aware though also that when you do a forced update, it will automatically restart the container. So just be aware, if you're maybe running a web container on there and you're actually serving content from your location to the internet, that connections will be dropped whilst UNRAID restarts that container. Okay guys, so that's the end of the video. I hope you learned a few things. And more importantly, I hope it's given you the inspiration now to go away and go and pull some different containers. So hope you found this video useful. If you did, please give it a like, give it a thumbs up, and consider subscribing to this channel. I do various different UNRAID related content videos, in addition to home labbing and development and Linux, etc. And if you do decide to subscribe, then great, and I look forward to you watching some of my other videos in future. But for now, I'm going to sign off. Have a great evening or morning or whatever time it is now, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much.